It has been claimed by various health organisations and news outlets that eating red meat causes cancer. However, are these claims actually valid and backed up by hard scientific evidence, or is this just another case of bad science and weak evidence that's been blown out of proportion, which is all too common when it comes to diet and lifestyle advice? Unfortunately, almost all the studies on red meat and processed meat are lower quality observational studies, and not high quality randomised controlled trials. And so this is where we will start. The difference between an observational study and a randomised controlled trial will become clearer throughout the video, along with the major flaws that observational studies have. Let's look at one of the studies that supports the narrative of red meat leading to increased cancer. A 2019 study looked at data from the UK Biobank with just under 500,000 participants. Diet and lifestyle habits were reported at the start of the study using food frequency questionnaires, and their health outcomes were tracked over the following years. The researchers found that each 50 gram per day increment in red meat intake was associated with an 18% greater risk of colorectal cancer, which might sound scary as a newspaper headline. However, this study is only observational, and so they haven't controlled for any experimental factors at all. They've only observed that people who happen to have a higher intake of red meat just so happen to have an increased chance of colorectal cancer. But those in the study who consumed more red meat were also, on average, older, much more likely to smoke, had higher body fat, and consumed more alcohol, all of which are factors that will increase your cancer risk. And so it is impossible to separate out the effect of red meat from other factors and to determine from this experiment if red meat consumption actually causes cancer, a fact that the authors conveniently forgot to mention. Another large-scale study is the European Prospective Investigation into Cancer and Nutrition, or the EPIC study. This is another observational study in which 450,000 participants were recruited across Europe, and their diet and lifestyle habits were recorded through questionnaires at the start of the study, and then their health outcomes were tracked over the following years and decades. After statistical analysis, they found a very small increase in all-cause mortality associated with red meat consumption, with a hazard rate of 1.02, or a 2% increase. But this value is so small that it is within experimental error of having no effect. And so this study actually found no statistically significant effect of red meat consumption on mortality. It did find a weak effect of processed meat consumption, which was associated with a 9% or 18% increase in mortality, depending on the statistical analysis method. But the EPIC study again has the same issues as the previous study. It is only observational and so can only give us a correlation and not a causation. And again, those participants who ate more red and processed meats were also more likely to be overweight, older, ate more calories in general, consumed more alcohol, and were more likely to be smokers and did less exercise. And all of these are confounding factors that increase the chance of death, completely irrespective of meat intake. And with the effect of red and processed meat intake being so weak, it is impossible to know if red meat consumption is actually associated with increased cancer risk, or if it's due to other larger factors that are different between the groups like smoking, drinking, exercise, and so on. How does this evidence compare to other things like smoking that has been widely accepted to cause cancer for decades? If we look at a recent meta-analysis in the British Medical Journal, we can see that the relative risk from smoking is much higher, with an average risk of about 7, which means that those who smoke have a 7 times higher chance of developing lung cancer compared to those who don't smoke. This is a 700% increase in cancer risk compared to just a 2% increase in the EPIC study, which is a 350-fold difference. And so the association is incredibly weak compared to smoking. Moreover, to establish causation, you genuinely need a well-designed randomized controlled trial, in which you take a large group of people and then randomly assign them between 2 different diets. By randomly assigning them between the 2 groups, then on average, all the other diet, lifestyle, or genetic factors will be roughly identical between both groups. And so the only significant difference between the 2 groups will be the diet that you've assigned to them. And so you can work out exactly what the effect of changing the diet is. If you don't have a well-designed randomized controlled trial, then it's harder to establish a causation. And in order to do so, you have to follow the Bradford-Hill criteria. One thing you require from the criteria is that you have very consistent observational studies that show a very strong correlation, but this alone is not enough. You also need a good relationship between dose and response, which would have to show strongly that larger doses of red meat would lead to a higher cancer risk. And you also need to establish a plausible biochemical mechanism by which red meat could cause cancer. And this criteria has been applied to establish a causation between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, which shows a very strong correlation between the two, with a strong dose response and plausible mechanisms by which cigarette smoking could cause cancer. And so we've looked at 2 papers so far, but what about when we look at all the data? Is there any consistent and strong correlations between meat consumption and cancer? A 2019 meta-analysis of cohort studies looked at 61 publications covering more than 4 million participants, and they examined the effects of unprocessed and processed red meat intake on all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and diabetes. And what they found was that reducing both unprocessed and processed red meat was associated with a very small reduction in mortality. But the evidence for this very small reduction was extremely weak, with only a low to very low certainty in the result, leading the authors to conclude that the magnitude of the effect of red meat, if it even exists, is very small. And so the best evidence from observational studies that we have says that actually there's either no effect of red meat consumption on cancer, or if there is an effect, it is very small. But that is not all. I mentioned before that if something causes cancer, then there should be a strong dose-response relationship. So increasing the dose increases the cancer chance. So what is the dose-response relationship for red meat? Well, there isn't one. Looking at this data from the Netherlands, there is no increase in cancer chance with increasing red meat intake at all, only a flat line. And similar is seen for processed meat intake. There is no significant change as the processed meat intake increases, just another flat line. What about the best available evidence, which are randomized controlled trials that can actually establish causation? Well, a 2019 systematic review concluded from the small number of studies they found that, to quote, low to very low certainty evidence suggests that diets restricted in red meat may have little or no effect on major cardiometabolic outcomes and cancer mortality and incidence. And so the few randomized controlled trials that exist don't show any causation between red meat intake and cancer. Now, we're really starting to clutch at straws to find any evidence that red meat or processed meat causes cancer at all. So let's see if we have any plausible mechanisms. Korean researchers have reviewed the main suggested mechanisms by which red and processed meat have been suggested to cause cancer. One of these is an excessive intake of iron. However, many foods like fish, shellfish, teas, and spices contain multiple times the iron content of red and processed meat. And so this theory really seems to fall flat. And most processed meats are made out of pork, which is lower in iron than beef and lamb. Other potentially harmful substances can be produced in cooking. The 3 main groups are called heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and N-nitroso compounds. Heterocyclic amines are produced when high protein foods are heated to high temperatures in cooking. But this, of course, means that chicken, fish, and other non-red meats all contain them as well. And so this clearly wouldn't make red meat any different. What about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons? Well, these are actually present in most food groups, with most of the intake of them coming from cereal grains, fats and oils, fruits and vegetables, and sugars, and not coming from meat. And so this mechanism doesn't seem to add up either. What about the last one, which is N-nitroso compounds? These are produced due to reactions with nitrogen-containing compounds like nitrates and nitrites that are commonly used as preservatives in cured meats. And you may have seen some supermarket brands trying to sell nitrite and nitrate-free bacon. The problem with this is that fruits and vegetables actually contain higher concentrations of these compounds than red and processed meats. And so if you're arguing that nitrogen compounds cause cancer, then you're also arguing that fruits and vegetables cause cancer. The authors also made the point that the amount of these harmful substances in food is actually 1/1,000,000th of the level that is thought to cause cancer. And so it looks like claims that red and processed meats cause cancer are completely unfounded. The only evidence to support it is from very low quality observational studies in which the people consuming more red meat were also older, drank more alcohol, smoked more cigarettes, had higher body fat, and did less exercise. All of which are more convincing reasons for a higher cancer rate than meat consumption. There is also no effect of increasing meat intake on cancer rates in dose-response studies. And randomized control trials that are higher quality studies show no significant impact of red meat intake on cancer. There also seems to be no plausible mechanism by which red meat could cause cancer. And so the claim that red meat causes cancer is clearly bullshit. It is not backed up by the scientific evidence, and those health authorities and journalists that repeat the claim seem to lack a basic understanding that correlations do not equal causation, which I find frankly very worrying indeed. For more content like this, check out the rest of my videos, and if you want to support the channel, you can do so via PayPal or Buy Me Coffee, which are linked in the description below.